Avery's hands trembled as she balanced the crystal champagne flutes, each worth more than her monthly rent. The Pinnacle Club's exclusive merger dinner hummed with power, billionaires reshaping industries with handshake deals. She'd worked triple shifts for this catering gig, desperate to cover her grandmother's medical bills. "Careful with those, sweetheart. People like you shouldn't even be touching them." Ethan Blackwood's voice cut through the ambient chatter. Tech mogul, 35, worth $12 billion. His cold gray eyes assessed her like she was furniture, disposable, replaceable. Avery met his gaze steadily, noting something he'd missed entirely. The merger documents on his table bore her family's corporate seal, the same seal tattooed discreetly behind her ear. Tonight, the waitress uniform was just a costume. By dawn, she'd own his company. He had no idea what storm was coming. The mahogany doors of the Pinnacle Club whispered shut behind Avery Preston as she stepped into a world that had once been her birthright. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors, illuminating faces that graced Forbes covers and congressional hearings. Tonight, she was invisible among them, just another service worker in black polyester, carrying silver trays and swallowing pride with every forced smile. The irony wasn't lost on her that viewers might be watching this unfold from their own struggles, perhaps commenting from their kitchen tables or lunch breaks, wondering how someone like her could navigate such a shark-infested world. But Avery had learned patience in the hardest school of all, necessity. The merger dinner represented everything she'd lost and everything she planned to reclaim. Blackwood Industries was acquiring Preston Technologies, her father's company, her legacy, her family's life work, in a deal that would strip mine the innovative patents and leave hundreds of employees jobless. The acquisition documents lay scattered across linen tablecloths like death certificates, each signature bringing Ethan Blackwood closer to dismantling 15 years of her family's vision. She moved between tables with practiced invisibility, refilling water glasses and collecting whispered conversations that revealed the true nature of tonight's gathering. Corporate cannibalism disguised as fine dining. Ethan commanded the head table like a general surveying conquered territory. His charcoal suit cost more than most people's cars, tailored to emphasize broad shoulders that had never known real work. When he laughed at his own jokes, the sound carried no warmth, only the hollow ring of someone who'd forgotten how to feel genuine joy. Board members and investors hung on his every word, their sycophantic agreement orchestrated by the promise of massive returns. Avery cataloged each face, memorizing names and weaknesses, filing away information that would prove invaluable in the coming hours. "Miss," Ethan's voice snapped like a whip as she approached his table. His gray eyes raked over her with undisguised contempt, taking in her polyester uniform and sensible shoes. "These glasses are spotted. People paying $50,000 a plate expect better service." He held up a crystal flute that sparkled without a single blemish. His lie so casual, it revealed the depth of his cruelty. The table fell silent, board members shifting uncomfortably as they witnessed their leader's sadistic need to humiliate someone who couldn't fight back. Avery felt their collective embarrassment on her behalf, but also their cowardice in refusing to speak up. She replaced the perfect glass with another perfect glass, her movements deliberately slow and graceful. "Of course, sir. My apologies." The words tasted like ash, but they served their purpose. Ethan's smirk widened as he dismissed her with a wave, already turning back to his conquest tales. But Avery had accomplished something far more valuable than ego preservation. She'd positioned herself close enough to read the merger timeline upside down. Phase 1 completion, midnight tonight. Phase 2 authorization, tomorrow morning. The papers bore signatures from every major stakeholder except one, the mysterious Preston Family Trust representative whose identity had been kept confidential throughout negotiations. As she retreated toward the kitchen, Avery's fingers brushed against the corporate seal embossed on Ethan's briefcase, the same intricate design that marked her as Diana Preston's daughter and sole heir. Her father had chosen that symbol carefully, a phoenix rising from flames, representing rebirth through destruction. Tonight, that symbolism would prove prophetic in ways Ethan couldn't imagine. She glanced back once to see him leaning forward conspiratorially, his voice carrying just far enough for her trained ears to catch fragments. Preston Technologies won't exist by Christmas. Gut the R&D department. Patents alone worth billions. The kitchen buzzed with controlled chaos as servers prepared for the next course, their movements choreographed by years of serving New York's elite. Avery slipped through the organized madness unnoticed, her mind racing through contingency plans and backup strategies. 20 feet away, Ethan was finalizing the destruction of her family legacy while she stood powerless in polyester and sensible shoes. But appearances could be deceiving, and Avery had learned to weaponize underestimation. Her phone vibrated against her hip. Connor Mackenzie confirming legal documents were filed and ready for activation. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Ethan's briefcase sat unguarded on his chair as he moved to the bar for cigars and brandy. Corporate America's golden boy. So arrogant he'd never considered that the waitress might pose any threat to his empire. Avery moved with practiced efficiency, her server's training providing perfect cover as she leaned over his table to collect dessert plates. Her fingers found the slim manila folder that had fallen between his chair and briefcase, acquisition timelines, and board authorization codes that would prove invaluable in the coming hours. She palmed the documents with the smooth precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. As midnight approached and the dinner wound toward its conclusion, Avery felt the familiar calm that preceded battle. Ethan raised his champagne flute in a toast to eliminating inefficient competition, his words painting her father's life work as corporate deadweight. The assembled billionaires applauded his vision, their approval sealing the fate of hundreds of families whose livelihoods depended on Preston Technologies. But none of them noticed the waitress in the corner, whose steady hands and calculating eyes promised that this victory celebration was about to become something else entirely. The real game was just beginning, and Ethan Blackwood had no idea he'd already lost. The crystal water pitcher felt heavier in Avery's hands as she approached Ethan's table for the third time that evening, each step measured and deliberate despite the tremor of anticipation running through her veins. The merger documents she'd photographed earlier painted a picture of calculated devastation. Preston Technologies would be dismantled within 60 days, its patents absorbed into Blackwood's portfolio while 600 employees received termination notices. She steadied her breathing, knowing that the next few minutes would either advance her carefully orchestrated plan or destroy months of preparation. The pitcher caught the chandelier light, creating dancing reflections across the white linen as she moved between chairs occupied by some of America's most powerful figures. Ethan was mid-sentence, regaling his audience with a story about acquiring a sustainable energy startup solely to bury their patents and preserve his fossil fuel investments. His laughter filled the space between crystal glasses and silver cutlery, a sound devoid of humanity that made Avery's skin crawl with its casual cruelty. She began refilling water glasses around the table's perimeter, her movements creating the perfect cover for eavesdropping on conversations that revealed the true depth of his corporate sociopathy. Board member Vivian Ashford nodded approvingly as Ethan described crushing a family-owned renewable company, her own champagne glass raised in toast to their collective greed. The beautiful thing about desperate sellers, Ethan continued, gesturing expansively with his brandy snifter, is how quickly they abandon their principles when faced with foreclosure. Preston Technologies thinks they're negotiating from strength, but their quarterly reports tell a different story. He leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a predator describing his hunting strategy, completely oblivious to the fact that his prey was standing 3 feet away with a water pitcher. Avery's hand remained steady as she filled Quentin Fairfax's glass, her face a mask of professional invisibility while her mind cataloged every word for future use. The accident happened with perfect timing and unfortunate consequences. Avery's elbow caught the edge of Vivian Ashford's purse as the older woman gestured dramatically, sending the heavy leather bag sliding across the polished table surface. Water cascaded from the pitcher in a crystalline arc, missing Ethan by inches but thoroughly soaking the acquisition documents spread before him. The table erupted in gasps and exclamations as expensive ink ran like tears across soaked paper, transforming legal contracts into abstract art. Avery's face flushed with perfectly timed embarrassment as she reached for napkins, her apologies tumbling over each other in a symphony of professional mortification. "You clumsy little—" Ethan's voice cracked like a bullwhip across the suddenly silent dining room. His face contorted with rage as he shot to his feet, brandy snifter still clutched in his white-knuckled fist. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Those documents were irreplaceable." The volume of his fury drew attention from neighboring tables, creating an audience for his public humiliation of someone he perceived as powerless. Avery continued dabbing at the soaked papers with cloth napkins, her movements frantic and apologetic, while her mind calculated the perfect moment to escalate the situation. "Sir, I'm so terribly sorry," she stammered, her voice pitched high with manufactured distress. "Please let me get the manager. We can have these dried and—" But Ethan cut her off with a gesture so dismissive it bordered on assault, his hand coming within inches of her face as he made his disgust physically manifest. The surrounding billionaires watched with the uncomfortable fascination of accident observers, some leaning forward to witness the spectacle, while others studied their champagne flutes with sudden intensity. Vivian Ashford's lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, not at Ethan's behavior, but at Avery's mere existence in their rarefied world. "People like you," Ethan seethed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper that somehow carried further than his shouting, "shouldn't even be touching crystal that costs more than your yearly salary. You have no concept of value, no understanding of what real achievement looks like." He gestured toward the ruined documents with theatrical disgust, playing to his audience of enablers and sycophants. "This is exactly why service positions should require background checks. We let just anyone handle our affairs, and this is the result." His words hit their target with surgical precision, designed to strip away dignity and reduce her to less than human in front of witnesses. The silence stretched like pulled taffy as Avery absorbed his assault with downcast eyes and trembling hands. She felt the weight of every gaze in the dining room, some pitying, most indifferent, a few openly enjoying the spectacle of someone being put in their place. Her phone buzzed against her hip, probably Connor or Agent Cross confirming their positions for the evening's real entertainment. But she maintained her performance of crushed servitude, allowing Ethan's cruelty to marinate in the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere he'd created. Several board members shifted in their seats, their own discomfort with his behavior beginning to show despite their financial dependence on his goodwill. "I'll pay for the damages, sir," Avery whispered, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. "I know it doesn't fix anything, but I take full responsibility." The offer was meaningless. Her supposed waitress salary couldn't cover a single page of legal documentation, but it served to highlight the vast chasm between their perceived stations in life. Ethan's laughter came sharp and bitter, a sound that made even his closest allies flinch with its calculated cruelty. He was enjoying this too much, revealing character flaws that would serve Avery's purposes perfectly when the time came for public judgment. As she gathered the soggy remains of contracts and acquisition timelines, Avery's fingers brushed against something unexpected. Ethan's personal phone, apparently knocked from the table during the water catastrophe. The device had slid partially under his chair, its sleek surface reflecting the chandelier light like a technological mirror. She palmed it with the same smooth efficiency she'd used on the documents earlier, her movements disguised by the frantic cleaning ritual. Ethan continued his verbal assault, too drunk on his own power to notice that his communications lifeline had vanished into the hands of his supposed victim. The chapter closed with Avery retreating toward the kitchen, Ethan's phone secure in her apron pocket and his voice still echoing across the dining room as he performed righteous indignation for his captive audience. She paused at the kitchen door to glance back, memorizing the faces of those who'd witnessed his cruelty without intervention. In 6 hours, those same faces would watch him fall from grace with the same passive fascination they'd shown tonight. But this time, they'd be watching someone who deserved their judgment, and Avery would make sure they understood exactly what kind of man they'd been enabling. The service corridor behind the Pinnacle Club's main dining room offered perfect acoustics for eavesdropping, its 19th century architecture creating sound channels that carried conversations with startling clarity. Avery pressed herself against the mahogany wainscoting, Ethan's stolen phone warm in her palm as she listened to him conduct what he believed was a private conversation. The device had already yielded its treasures. Passwords saved in predictable patterns, emails confirming illegal stock manipulations, and text messages revealing the true scope of his corporate empire's criminal activities. But the conversation unfolding 20 feet away promised intelligence that no digital trail could provide. "The board's getting restless," Vivian Ashford's voice carried through the carved oak panels with crystal clarity. "3 consecutive quarters of declining profits, and now this Preston acquisition is our Hail Mary. If it falls through." Her sentence trailed into meaningful silence, the kind that preceded corporate executions and golden parachute deployments. Avery heard the distinctive clink of brandy against crystal as Ethan poured himself liquid courage to face whatever ultimatum his board chair was delivering. The irony wasn't lost on her that his own people were circling like vultures, ready to devour him at the first sign of weakness. Ethan's response revealed fractures in his seemingly invincible facade. 6 months. That's what they promised me when we restructured the debt. 6 months to turn things around or face a vote of no confidence. His voice carried a tremor that his public persona never revealed, the slight crack in his armor that Avery had been waiting to exploit. She pressed the phone's screen, activating its recording function as he continued. "Preston Technologies isn't just another acquisition anymore. It's life support. Their renewable energy patents alone are worth $8 billion, and their research pipeline could carry us for the next decade." The conversation painted a picture of desperation disguised as aggression, revealing Ethan's hostile takeover strategy as the desperate gambit of a failing empire, rather than the calculated expansion he'd portrayed to investors. Avery's mind raced through the implications. If Blackwood Industries was truly on the brink of collapse, then his ability to complete the Preston acquisition depended entirely on maintaining the illusion of corporate strength. One well-timed revelation of his company's true financial state would send his stock price plummeting and void every contract on tonight's table. Her grandmother, the real Diana Preston, had been right about waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "What about the Preston Family Trust?" Vivian's question cut straight to the heart of Avery's carefully orchestrated plan. "Our legal team still hasn't identified the trust representative. Without their signature, we can't complete the acquisition regardless of how desperate the board becomes." Ethan's silence stretched long enough to suggest he was drinking again, probably calculating how much truth he could reveal to his own board chair without appearing completely incompetent. The trust representative's identity had been the most closely guarded secret of the entire negotiation, protected by layers of shell companies and legal proxies that even Blackwood's army of corporate lawyers couldn't penetrate. "Anonymous proxy authorization," Ethan finally replied, his voice carrying the false confidence of someone whistling past graveyards. "Legal confirmed that whoever holds the trust can authorize the sale without revealing their identity. As long as the paperwork clears probate court by tomorrow afternoon, we're golden." He was gambling everything on a legal technicality, betting his entire empire on the assumption that Preston Technologies' mysterious heir would remain passive in the face of his corporate assault. The hubris was breathtaking in its scope and vulnerability. Avery's own phone vibrated with an urgent message from Connor Mackenzie. "Phase 1 complete. Federal investigators confirm Blackwood's SEC violations. Ready to proceed on your signal." The text confirmed what months of investigation had uncovered. Ethan's empire was built on a foundation of securities fraud, tax evasion, and illegal market manipulation that would crumble under federal scrutiny. Her response was brief but decisive. "Initiate Phase 2. Time to introduce them to the trust representative." She ended the message with a photograph of herself in the waitress uniform, knowing Connor would appreciate the theatrical irony of their strategy. The overhead lights flickered as the building's vintage electrical system struggled with the evening's power demands, creating momentary shadows that seemed to dance across the service corridor's narrow confines. Avery used the distraction to slip deeper into the building's maze of servant passages, following memorized blueprints toward the executive conference room where Ethan would inevitably retreat for his final strategy session. These corridors had once served bootleggers during Prohibition, their hidden routes perfect for modern corporate espionage. Her heels clicked softly against polished wood as she navigated turns that would position her for the evening's climactic revelation. The envelope waited exactly where Connor had promised, tucked behind a historical painting that depicted robber barons from America's first Gilded Age. The irony of its placement wasn't accidental. Her legal team possessed a gift for symbolic gestures that would play perfectly in tomorrow's headlines. Inside the manila folder lay documents that would transform tonight's merger celebration into Ethan's corporate funeral, federal investigation warrants, SEC violation reports, and most importantly, the official proxy authorization identifying Avery Preston as the sole heir to Diana Preston's estate and controlling interest in Preston Technologies. Her fingers traced the embossed seal that marked her true identity, the same phoenix design that graced Ethan's stolen documents. For 10 years, she'd hidden behind fake names and manufactured backgrounds, working service jobs while her legal team assembled the evidence needed to destroy the man who'd murdered her mother. Tonight's humiliation in the dining room had been the final piece of her psychological profile. Ethan Blackwood was a sadist who enjoyed crushing those he perceived as weak. That character flaw would make his public downfall even more satisfying when the weak turned out to be stronger than he'd ever imagined. The distant sound of laughter echoed through the corridor as Ethan's dinner party reached its crescendo, oblivious to the storm approaching from the building's hidden passages. Avery checked her watch. 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes, the merger deadline would expire, and Blackwood Industries would officially enter acquisition proceedings. But by then, the prey would have revealed itself as the hunter, and America's corporate media would have a story that would dominate headlines for months. She straightened her polyester uniform and prepared for the performance of a lifetime. Ethan's phone felt like a live grenade in Avery's pocket as she approached his table with practiced servility. Her footsteps silent on marble floors that had witnessed decades of power brokered through handshakes and betrayal. The device contained enough evidence to destroy his empire twice over. Emails detailing bribes to government officials, recorded conversations about stock manipulation, and text messages coordinating the hostile takeover of 17 small businesses in the past 2 years. But returning it now served a greater purpose than keeping it, establishing herself as trustworthy in his eyes while demonstrating the kind of integrity that would make his eventual downfall more satisfying to witnesses. Mr. Blackwood. She approached his chair with downcast eyes and trembling hands, the picture of a chastened servant seeking redemption. I found this under your table when I was cleaning up my mess. I'm so sorry for all the trouble I've caused tonight. She extended the phone with both hands, her gesture deliberately subservient while her mind catalogued every micro-expression that crossed his face. Surprise, suspicion, then grudging acknowledgement. He hadn't even realized his communications lifeline was missing, too drunk on his own cruelty to notice the theft. His fingers closed around the device with possessive greed, immediately checking for damage to its pristine surface. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying the patronizing tone reserved for children and service workers. At least you're honest. Most people would have pocketed something this expensive. The backhanded compliment revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. He truly believed that poverty automatically bred criminality, that anyone in her supposed position would naturally resort to theft. His board members nodded approvingly at this display of magnanimous forgiveness, their relief palpable as the evening's social awkwardness dissolved into comfortable condescension. They preferred their cruelty tempered with paternalistic benevolence, cruelty disguised as character building. But Avery had accomplished far more than simple reputation rehabilitation. During the phone's absence, Connor Mackenzie's team had installed surveillance software that would transmit every call, text, and email directly to federal investigators. The device was now a Trojan horse in Ethan's pocket, broadcasting his crimes in real time to Agent Lila Cross and her task force. More importantly, she'd observed his security patterns, passwords entered with muscle memory, trusted contacts called without hesitation, and most crucially, his complete inability to imagine that anyone might be sophisticated enough to outmaneuver him. I hope the documents weren't completely ruined, Avery continued, her voice pitched with manufactured concern. I know how important they must be for tomorrow's signing. The seemingly innocent comment was a fishing expedition designed to extract information about his timeline and backup plans. Ethan's eyes flicked toward his briefcase, where replacement papers waited, his body language revealing the location of contingency documents that Connor's team would need to intercept. He was so accustomed to being the smartest person in any room that he'd never learned to guard his reactions against genuine intelligence. "The lawyers have copies," he replied dismissively, already turning back toward his dinner companions as if her existence was merely a temporary interruption in more important conversations. Some things are too valuable to trust to single documents. The casual arrogance in his statement would have been breathtaking if Avery hadn't spent months studying his pathological need to demonstrate superiority over anyone he perceived as beneath him. But his words also confirmed that the original acquisition contracts were stored in his downtown office, information that Agent Cross's warrant would put to excellent use in approximately 4 hours. As she retreated toward the kitchen, Avery's trained eyes cataloged the subtle signs of tension radiating through the dining room like ripples in poisoned water. Quentin Fairfax kept checking his phone for stock market updates, his face growing paler with each refresh as Blackwood Industries' after-hours trading showed unusual volatility. Vivian Ashford's champagne remained untouched, her attention focused on whispered conversations with board members whose body language suggested growing concern about their leader's stability. The merger celebration was beginning to feel more like a wake, though none of them understood whose funeral they were attending. The kitchen buzzed with end-of-evening efficiency as servers prepared final courses and began the ritual of closing procedures. Avery moved through the controlled chaos with practiced invisibility, her mind focused on the burner phone hidden in her locker and the coded message she needed to send to Connor. "Package delivered, contents uploaded, Phase 3 authorized for midnight activation." The text would trigger a cascade of legal actions that would transform tomorrow's headlines from corporate merger to federal investigation, complete with perp walks and congressional hearings. Her reflection in the stainless steel prep counter showed a woman playing the role of victim with Academy Award precision, but her eyes carried the cold calculation of someone who'd spent a decade planning this moment. The polyester uniform and sensible shoes were props in a performance designed to highlight the vast gulf between appearance and reality. In 6 hours, she'd shed this costume for a power suit that cost more than most cars, but the transformation would serve a purpose beyond mere theatrics. It would demonstrate that America's corporate elite had failed to recognize real power when it served them water and accepted their abuse. The security footage from tonight's dinner would become evidence in federal court, each frame documenting Ethan's systematic humiliation of someone he believed was powerless. His casual cruelty toward service workers wasn't just morally repugnant. It was politically toxic in an era when social media could transform private moments into public relations disasters. The video of him berating a waitress would play on every news channel in America, providing perfect context for his criminal indictment and corporate downfall. Ethan's laughter echoed through the dining room as he regaled his audience with another story of corporate conquest, completely unaware that his target was listening from 20 feet away and recording every word for federal prosecutors. His hubris had reached levels that would have been comical if the human cost weren't so devastating. 600 families would lose their livelihoods. Renewable energy research would be buried for profit, and America's transition to sustainable technology would be delayed by years. But his greatest mistake wasn't underestimating his opposition. It was revealing his true character to someone with the power to destroy him. As midnight approached and the merger deadline loomed, Avery felt the familiar calm that preceded justice. The real game was about to begin, and Ethan Blackwood had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. His empire was built on a foundation of lies, brutality, and exploitation that wouldn't survive exposure to genuine scrutiny. Tomorrow's sunrise would illuminate a very different corporate landscape, one where predators faced consequences and victims possessed the power to fight back. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey was about to reveal its true nature. The service elevator descended into the Pinnacle Club's basement archives with Victorian-era mechanical precision, its brass fittings and mahogany panels a testament to an age when craftsmanship mattered more than quarterly profit margins. Avery stood motionless as floors passed in measured intervals, her reflection fractured in the polished metal of the control panel that had operated continuously since 1912. Tonight marked exactly 10 years since Diana Preston's supposed death in a car accident that investigation had revealed as corporate assassination, a hit orchestrated by Ethan Blackwood to eliminate his most dangerous competitor and steal the renewable energy patents that now form the backbone of his failing empire. The basement archives contained more than historical documents and vintage wine collections. Hidden behind a false wall lay the command center where Diana Preston had spent the last decade orchestrating her resurrection and revenge. Avery's hands found the concealed switch that her mother had shown her years ago, when a frightened 20-year-old girl had learned that her previous life was ending and her education in corporate warfare was beginning. The mahogany panel swung open with well-oiled silence, revealing a sophisticated operation that would have impressed intelligence agencies. Banks of computer monitors, filing cabinets filled with evidence, and photographs documenting every crime committed by Blackwood Industries since Diana's fake funeral. "Hello, Mother," Avery said quietly as she stepped into the hidden room where Diana Preston waited with the patience of someone who'd spent a decade planning this moment. The woman who'd taught her daughter that true power came from being underestimated rose from behind a desk covered in legal documents and federal investigation reports. At 57, Diana retained the sharp intelligence that had built Preston Technologies from a garage startup into a renewable energy empire. But her eyes now carried the cold fury of someone who'd watched her life's work stolen by a sociopathic criminal. Diana's embrace carried the warmth of a mother reunited with her child and the steel of a general greeting her most trusted lieutenant. "How did he react to tonight's performance?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd grown up in Pennsylvania coal country before earning degrees from MIT and Harvard Business School. The question wasn't idle curiosity. Every aspect of Ethan's psychological profile had been studied and cataloged to predict his responses to pressure. His need to humiliate those he perceived as weak would make his eventual downfall more publicly satisfying and legally devastating. "Exactly as we predicted," Avery replied, settling into the chair across from her mother's desk. "Cruel, arrogant, and completely blind to any threat that doesn't wear a $3,000 suit. He actually thanked me for returning his phone after we'd already copied everything." She handed Diana the flash drive containing Ethan's communications, financial records, and enough evidence to support criminal indictments on 17 separate charges. The device represented the culmination of months of careful infiltration and patient intelligence gathering. The wall monitors displayed real-time updates from Connor McKenzie's legal team and Agent Cross's federal task force, their coordinated efforts creating a net that was closing around Ethan's empire with mechanical precision. Stock prices fluctuated as anonymous sources leaked information about Blackwood Industries' true financial condition, while media contacts prepared stories that would dominate tomorrow's news cycles. Diana's network included journalists, prosecutors, and politicians who'd been waiting years for the opportunity to expose the corruption that had infected America's corporate structure. "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon," Diana explained, pulling up holographic displays that showed Blackwood Industries' organizational chart and financial structure. "Vivian Ashford will call for a vote of no confidence the moment she realizes the Preston acquisition has failed. But by then, federal agents will already have seized their assets and arrested their leadership for securities fraud." The plan's elegance lay in its simplicity. Rather than fighting Ethan directly, they were allowing his own greed and incompetence to destroy him while providing law enforcement with irrefutable evidence of his crimes. Avery studied her reflection in the dark computer screens, seeing herself transformed from powerless victim to architect of justice. The waitress uniform would soon be replaced by the power suit hanging in her mother's private closet. But the real transformation had occurred years ago when a traumatized college student had decided to become someone capable of bringing down corporate monsters. The education had been brutal, learning to suppress emotion, to plan years in advance, and to weaponize her opponent's prejudices against them. But tonight proved that every sacrifice had been worth the result. "There's something else," Diana continued, her fingers dancing across a keyboard that controlled surveillance networks throughout Manhattan's financial district. "Ethan's personal communications reveal that Preston Technologies wasn't his only target. He's been systematically destroying renewable energy companies across the country, using insider information to manipulate stock prices and force bankruptcy sales. The federal case will expand far beyond our family's stolen patents. The revelation added context to their personal vendetta. They weren't just seeking individual justice, but exposing a conspiracy that had set back America's environmental progress by decades. The hidden room's sophistication reflected resources that went far beyond a single family's wealth. Diana's resurrection had been supported by other victims of corporate predators, creating an informal network of entrepreneurs, inventors, and business leaders who'd lost everything to Ethan's systematic theft. Their combined resources had funded the legal team, surveillance equipment, and political connections necessary to challenge someone with $12 billion and an army of corporate lawyers. Justice required matching resources with criminal enterprise. "Your grandmother would have been proud," Diana said softly, referring to the woman whose medical crisis had provided Avery's cover story for desperate employment. The real Eleanor Preston had died peacefully 5 years ago, but her memory had inspired the foundation that would bear her name and support service workers seeking education and advancement. The irony was perfect. Ethan's cruelty toward working people would fund programs designed to help them escape the economic circumstances he'd exploited. As midnight approached, Avery felt the weight of identity shifting from costume to reality. The frightened waitress had been a performance, but Avery Preston, daughter, heir, and architect of justice, was stepping back into existence after years of carefully maintained fiction. Tomorrow's sunrise would reveal not just Ethan's crimes, but the resurrection of a family and company that he'd believed permanently destroyed. The phoenix on their corporate seal would prove prophetic in ways he'd never imagined. "It's time," Diana said, checking her watch as federal agents prepared to execute search warrants across 3 states simultaneously. "Connor confirms that all legal documents are filed and ready for activation. Agent Cross has teams positioned at Blackwood Industries headquarters and Ethan's personal residences. The media will receive their information packets in 4 hours, giving them time to prepare comprehensive coverage." The coordination required military precision, but Diana had spent a decade building relationships with people who understood that some crimes demanded extraordinary justice. Avery rose from her chair and moved toward the closet where her true identity waited in the form of a navy blue power suit that had been tailored specifically for tomorrow's revelation. The transformation from service worker to corporate executive would be more than symbolic. It would demonstrate that American business culture's obsession with appearance had blinded them to real intelligence and authentic power. The waitress uniform had been her disguise, but the suit would be her armor for the battle ahead. The elevator rose through floors that would soon witness Ethan Blackwood's empire crumbling in real time, carrying Avery toward a confrontation that had been 10 years in the making. Her reflection in the brass panel showed someone ready to claim her birthright and deliver justice that the legal system had been unable to provide. The hunting season was ending, and the prey was about to reveal its true nature to a predator who'd grown fat on unearned victories. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, and Avery Preston would finally step out of the shadows to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her family. The Pinnacle Club's executive boardroom occupied the building's penthouse level, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline that had witnessed decades of power brokered through handshakes and betrayals. Ethan paced behind the mahogany conference table like a caged predator, his earlier confidence eroded by phone calls that had revealed cracks in his carefully constructed empire. Stock prices were fluctuating wildly based on anonymous tips about Blackwood Industries' hidden debt, while board members demanded explanations he couldn't provide without admitting his own incompetence. The merger deadline had passed at midnight, leaving him exposed to creditors and competitors who'd been circling like vultures for months. Avery entered through service doors that opened with the whispered authority of someone who belonged in this rarefied atmosphere. But her polyester uniform had been replaced by a navy blue power suit that transformed her from invisible servant to commanding presence. The tailored jacket emphasized shoulders that had never known subservience, while her stride carried the confidence of someone comfortable with authentic power rather than its theatrical imitation. Ethan's conversation with Vivian Ashford died mid-sentence as he registered the impossibility of the waitress's transformation. his brandy snifter frozen halfway to his lips while his mind struggled to process what his eyes were showing him. "Good morning, Ethan," Avery said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than dismissed. "I believe we have some business to conclude." She moved to the head of the conference table with practiced ease, settling into the chair that Ethan had occupied minutes earlier with the natural grace of someone claiming their rightful place. The leather portfolio she carried contained documents that would reshape his understanding of everything that had transpired over the past 6 months. But her calm demeanor suggested that revelation was merely the opening move in a larger game. The board members who'd witnessed her humiliation 12 hours earlier now stared with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror as the implications of her presence began to register. Quentin Fairfax's phone buzzed with urgent messages from his trading desk, confirming that Blackwood Industries' stock price had entered free fall as federal investigators executed search warrants across 3 time zones. Vivian Ashford's champagne flute trembled in her manicured fingers as she recognized the corporate seal on Avery's business card, the same Phoenix design that had graced Preston Technologies' letterhead before Ethan's hostile takeover had supposedly eliminated the company forever. "This is impossible," Ethan whispered, his voice carrying the hollow uncertainty of someone whose understanding of reality had just shattered. "Diana Preston died 10 years ago. The acquisition was legal, verified by probate court and federal regulators." But even as he spoke, his eyes were cataloging details that hadn't registered during his earlier interactions with the waitress. The confidence in her posture, the expensive watch he dismissed as costume jewelry, and most damning, the intelligence in her gaze that he'd been too arrogant to recognize when it was hidden behind manufactured subservience. "My mother's death was carefully staged," Avery replied, sliding a manila folder across the polished table surface. "We needed time to document your crimes and build the legal case that would ensure you faced consequences for corporate murder." The folder contained photographs, financial records, and recorded conversations that painted a comprehensive picture of Ethan's criminal enterprise, from bribery and stock manipulation to the assassination plot that had forced Diana Preston into hiding. Each page represented months of careful investigation and patient intelligence gathering by a network of victims seeking justice. The distant sound of sirens echoed through the windows as federal agents surrounded the building, their coordinated arrival timed to prevent any attempt at document destruction or evidence tampering. Agent Lila Cross had spent years building cases against corporate criminals who believed their wealth placed them above legal consequences. But tonight's operation represented the culmination of interagency cooperation that would set precedents for future prosecutions. The evidence Avery provided would support charges ranging from securities fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. "You can't prove any of this," Ethan snarled, but his voice carried the desperation of someone whose empire was crumbling in real time around him. "I have lawyers, political connections, resources that your little family business could never match." His threats rang hollow in the face of federal warrants and media exposure that would strip away the protection money had provided for decades. The board members who'd enabled his crimes were already calculating their own legal exposure, wondering whether cooperation with prosecutors might salvage their careers from the wreckage of their association with him. Avery's smile held no warmth as she activated a tablet that displayed live feeds from news broadcasts already covering the federal investigation. "Your lawyers are currently being arrested alongside you for obstruction of justice and conspiracy charges. Your political connections are distancing themselves faster than your stock price is falling. And your resources?" She gestured toward the windows where federal agents were setting up command posts in full view of financial district cameras. "Frozen pending investigation into money laundering and tax evasion charges that your own communications confirmed." The transformation in the room's power dynamics was absolute and irreversible. Decades of accumulated arrogance crashing into the reality of consequences that money couldn't deflect. Vivian Ashford set down her champagne flute with trembling fingers, already composing resignation letters in her mind as she calculated the distance between her own actions and criminal liability. Quentin Fairfax's phone rang continuously with calls from investors demanding explanations for losses that would ripple through portfolios worldwide. The merger celebration had become a wake for an empire built on exploitation and sustained by the belief that wealth provided immunity from justice. "The irony is beautiful," Avery continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd waited years for this moment. "Your need to humiliate people you perceived as powerless provided the perfect psychological profile for federal prosecutors. Tonight's security footage shows exactly the kind of character that juries love to convict." She stood and moved toward the windows, her silhouette framed against city lights that would soon illuminate headlines chronicling the largest corporate fraud case in American history. Ethan slumped into his chair with the defeated posture of someone whose understanding of reality had been completely inverted. His empire reduced to criminal evidence, and his legacy transformed from business success to cautionary tale. The waitress he'd dismissed as invisible had revealed herself as the most dangerous opponent he'd ever faced. Someone who'd spent a decade learning his weaknesses and preparing for total victory. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the prey had always been the predator, and the game had been rigged from the beginning. The boardroom fell silent except for the distant sounds of federal agents securing evidence and media crews setting up for live broadcasts that would dominate morning news cycles. Avery Preston had returned from the dead to reclaim her birthright and deliver justice that the legal system had been powerless to provide. Tomorrow's sunrise would illuminate a very different corporate landscape, one where consequences mattered more than connections and character counted more than capital. The phoenix had risen from flames that were only beginning to consume those who'd tried to bury it. The federal agents had cleared the boardroom of everyone except Avery and Ethan, their professional efficiency transforming the elegant space into an impromptu interrogation facility where justice would be served without ceremony or delay. Ethan sat slumped in his chair like a marionette whose strings had been severed, his $12 billion empire reduced to evidence bags and asset seizure notices that federal prosecutors would use to build their case against corporate America's most celebrated predator. The silence between them carried the weight of 10 years' worth of carefully orchestrated revenge. But Avery felt no satisfaction in his defeat, only the cold certainty that some crimes demanded consequences regardless of their perpetrator's wealth or connections. "You killed my mother," Avery said quietly, her voice carrying the accumulated fury of a daughter who'd spent a decade planning this moment. "Not personally, of course. You hired professionals to make it look like an accident. But we have the bank records, the communications, the testimony from your hired killers who decided federal witness protection was preferable to your continued employment." She opened a leather portfolio that contained photocopied confessions and financial documents linking Ethan directly to Diana Preston's supposed death. Evidence that would support first-degree murder charges despite the passage of time. Ethan's laugh came sharp and bitter, the sound of someone whose arrogance remained intact even as his empire crumbled around him. "You can't prove intention beyond reasonable doubt. Corporate espionage, securities fraud, maybe some creative accounting, but murder? That's a desperate accusation from someone whose family couldn't compete in legitimate business." His words revealed the fundamental delusion that had driven his criminal behavior, the belief that success justified any means, and that victims deserve their fate for being weaker than their predators. "I don't need to prove anything," Avery replied with calm precision. "The federal prosecutors have confession videos from Marcus Chen and Rafael Montoya, the men you hired to stage my mother's accident. They've been in witness protection for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to testify against you." She slid a tablet across the table, its screen displaying court documents that outlined first-degree murder charges alongside the corporate crimes that had been her public focus. The murder case would proceed separately from the business fraud investigation, ensuring that justice would be served even if legal technicalities complicated financial prosecutions. The revelation hit Ethan like a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he realized the true scope of the evidence arrayed against him. His hired killers had recorded their conversations as insurance against eventual betrayal, creating an audio trail that documented his personal involvement in planning Diana Preston's death. The recordings would play for juries who'd already seen footage of him humiliating service workers, creating a complete character portrait of someone capable of casual cruelty and premeditated murder. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying the hollow desperation of someone whose understanding of power dynamics had been completely inverted. Money? Corporate restructuring? A public apology? He was still thinking like a businessman, calculating what price might purchase his freedom from consequences that money couldn't deflect. But Avery's expression showed no interest in negotiation or compromise. Justice wasn't a transaction that could be resolved through financial settlement or strategic concessions. "I want you to understand what you took from me," Avery said, standing and moving toward the windows that overlooked a city where thousands of families had been destroyed by his corporate greed. "Not just my mother's life, but 10 years of hiding, of pretending to be someone else, of working minimum wage jobs while you profited from stolen patents and murdered innovation." Her voice remained steady, but carried undertones of grief that no amount of legal victory could fully heal. Some wounds required acknowledgement rather than revenge, recognition rather than retribution. The tablet in her hands displayed financial projections showing how renewable energy development had been delayed by decades due to Ethan's systematic destruction of competing companies. Environmental damage, technological stagnation, and economic inequality could all be traced to his criminal enterprise and the political corruption that had enabled his crimes. The human cost extended far beyond individual victims to encompass societal harm that would require generations to repair. "I built an empire," Ethan protested, his voice carrying the petulant indignation of someone who'd never questioned his right to take whatever he wanted. "I created jobs, generated wealth, advanced American business interests in global markets." But his justifications rang hollow in the face of evidence showing how his empire had been constructed through theft, murder, and exploitation of workers whose labor had enriched him while their families struggled with poverty wages and non-existent benefits. "You built nothing," Avery replied with surgical precision. "You stole everything. The patents that made you rich belonged to my mother. The renewable energy technology you buried could have transformed American energy independence. The companies you destroyed through hostile takeovers represented innovation you couldn't match through legitimate competition." She returned to her chair with the measured calm of someone delivering a verdict rather than seeking argument or acknowledgement. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the windows as media crews positioned themselves for aerial shots of federal agents removing evidence from Blackwood Industries headquarters. Tomorrow's headlines would chronicle the largest corporate fraud investigation in American history, but tonight belonged to personal reckoning between a daughter and her mother's killer. The legal system would provide punishment, but emotional justice required this moment of absolute honesty about crimes that had shaped both their lives. 25 to life, Avery said quietly, citing the federal prosecutor's preliminary sentencing estimate for first-degree murder combined with corporate fraud charges. No possibility of parole, no plea bargains, no reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation. She stood and gathered her documents with the professional efficiency of someone whose business in this room was concluded. The waitress uniform lay folded in evidence bags that federal agents would use to document the psychological manipulation he'd employed against someone he'd believed was powerless. Ethan remained motionless as she moved toward the door, his empire reduced to asset seizure notices and criminal indictments that would dominate news cycles of suicide for months. The man who'd built his identity around wealth and power now faced decades in federal prison. His legacy transformed from business success to cautionary tale about the ultimate price of unchecked greed. The reckoning was complete, and justice had finally found someone who'd believed himself beyond its reach. Avery paused at the boardroom door for one final look at the man who'd stolen her mother and shaped her life through criminal ambition disguised as business acumen. Tomorrow, she would begin rebuilding Preston Technologies as a model of ethical corporate behavior. But tonight belonged to closure and the quiet satisfaction of promises kept to the dead. The phoenix had risen from flames that would continue burning until every enabler faced consequences and every victim received acknowledgement. Justice delayed was not justice denied when the right people possessed the patience to wait for perfect timing and absolute victory. 6 months had transformed Manhattan's financial district in ways that extended far beyond the empty office tower that once housed Blackwood Industries' criminal empire. The building stood as a monument to consequences, its darkened windows reflecting a city where corporate predators now understood that wealth provided no immunity from justice, and that victims possessed the resources and patience to fight back against systematic exploitation. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions on 97 separate charges, sending Ethan and his enablers to maximum security facilities where they would spend the remainder of their lives contemplating the ultimate price of unchecked greed and casual cruelty. Avery stood before the same Pinnacle Club audience that had witnessed her humiliation. But tonight, she commanded the podium as keynote speaker for a conference on corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. The navy blue suit she wore bore the same phoenix design that graced her family's restored company seal, while the audience included politicians, journalists, and business leaders who'd spent months studying the Preston Technologies case as a template for systemic reform. The transformation from invisible waitress to corporate CEO had become a parable about power dynamics and the dangerous assumptions that enabled exploitation to flourish in American business culture. 6 months ago, I served you champagne while you celebrated the destruction of my family's life work, Avery began, her voice carrying across a dining room where every face reflected varying degrees of shame and admiration. Tonight I want to talk about what I learned from that experience and what it reveals about the systems that allow corporate criminals to operate with impunity for decades. The audience listened with the rapt attention of people who'd witnessed history and understood their role as enablers in a criminal enterprise that had required their passive acceptance to function. Preston Technologies had been rebuilt as something more ambitious than its original incarnation. A model corporation that treated employees as stakeholders rather than resources, prioritized environmental sustainability over quarterly profits, and maintained transparent operations that invited public scrutiny rather than hiding behind legal technicalities. The company's renewable energy patents, stolen by Ethan and recovered through federal investigation, now formed the foundation of America's largest clean energy initiative, creating thousands of jobs while advancing environmental goals that had been delayed by decades of criminal interference. The Eleanor Preston Foundation, Avery continued, naming the organization after her grandmother and the fictional medical crisis that had provided cover for her infiltration, will provide education, legal support, and career advancement opportunities for service workers who've been systematically undervalued by an economy that profits from their exploitation. The Foundation's first initiative involved partnerships with community colleges and universities, offering full scholarships to students from working-class backgrounds who demonstrated potential for leadership in ethical business practices. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that Ethan's cruelty toward service workers had inspired programs designed to elevate the same people he'd dismissed as inherently inferior. Security footage from that evening had become required viewing in business ethics courses nationwide, demonstrating how prejudice and arrogance could blind successful people to intelligence and capability that didn't conform to their narrow expectations. The waitress uniform Avery had worn was now displayed in the Smithsonian as part of an exhibit on social justice and economic inequality. Real power, Avery explained to an audience that included several billionaires whose own business practices were under federal review, comes from lifting others rather than standing on their backs. Sustainable wealth is built through innovation and ethical competition, not through theft and exploitation disguised as business acumen. Her words carried the authority of someone who'd experienced both powerlessness and authentic influence, understanding the difference between temporary dominance and lasting leadership. The dining room fell silent as she introduced her special guest, Paige Hartwell, a 22-year-old former server whose own experiences with workplace harassment had inspired her to pursue legal studies through the Foundation's scholarship program. Paige's story echoed Avery's manufactured background, but her journey from service industry exploitation to law school represented authentic transformation rather than elaborate deception. The young woman's presence demonstrated how investment in human potential could create generational change that extended far beyond individual success stories. The service industry taught me that dignity isn't determined by job title or salary, Paige said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of her audience. Every person deserves respect regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. That's not just moral principle. It's practical wisdom. because you never know who's watching, learning, and planning their own contribution to justice. Her words carried an implicit warning that resonated with business leaders whose own treatment of employees was under increased scrutiny from federal investigators and social media activists. The evening concluded with Avery's announcement of congressional testimony scheduled for the following month, where she would recommend legislation requiring corporate executives to work minimum wage positions within their own companies for mandatory periods each year. The proposal had gained bipartisan support from politicians who recognized that authentic understanding of working conditions required personal experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Several major corporations had already implemented pilot programs that revealed systemic problems their leadership had never recognized from executive boardrooms. As the formal presentation ended and guests moved toward reception areas, Avery found herself surrounded by young professionals whose own stories echoed themes of underestimation and eventual triumph over systems designed to maintain artificial hierarchies. Their presence confirmed that her mother's murder and her own decade of preparation had catalyzed changes extending far beyond personal revenge to encompass genuine reform of business culture and legal accountability for corporate crimes. The transformation of American capitalism would require more than individual success stories or criminal prosecutions, but tonight represented significant progress toward an economy that valued character over capital and measured success through positive impact rather than accumulated wealth. Ethan Blackwood's empire had been built on exploitation and sustained through violence, but its destruction had created space for business models that prioritized sustainability and social responsibility over short-term profits and stock manipulation. Avery's final reflection, shared with reporters whose coverage would shape tomorrow's headlines, centered on the phoenix symbol that had guided her family through decades of persecution and eventual resurrection. True strength isn't demonstrated through cruelty toward those who seem powerless, she concluded, her words destined to become the foundation's official motto. It's revealed through the courage to challenge systems that enable exploitation and the wisdom to build alternatives that serve everyone's long-term interests. The evening ended with Avery keeping her old name tag as a reminder of where her journey had begun. But the real memorial to her experiences lay in the foundation's work and the reformed business practices spreading throughout American industry. Justice had been served, consequences delivered, and systemic change initiated through the patient intelligence of someone who'd understood that authentic victory required transformation rather than mere revenge. The waitress had become a CEO, but more importantly, the victim had become an architect of the justice that would protect future generations from the corporate predators who'd once seemed invincible. The end. If this story resonated with you, comment below where you're reading from. Your perspective on corporate power dynamics and social justice matters in shaping the conversations that drive real change.